So this is exercise 17 then again, I believe on the urinary system. This is the last lab that we'll go through in class. So your urinary system, its main function is to filter all the blood in the kidneys and then form waste and excrete it as urine. So if we look at a gross anatomy structure, you can see your kidneys with the adrenal glands located on top of the kidneys. The ureter takes the urine that's formed in the kidneys down to the urinary bladder where it's stored before urination. And the urethra, which is not labeled yet, will take the urine out of the body. So we have kidneys, adrenal glands, which secrete a lot of stress hormones, cortisol, mineral corticoids. The ureter takes the urine from the kidneys to be stored in the bladder. And then the urethra takes the urine out of the bladder, exiting out of the body. And these are the main structures and functions of the urinary system. The kidney also regulates the production of other regulates the regulation of electrolytes. And what that means is your kidneys will either secrete more electrolytes into the urine as waste or absorb them, like sodium, potassium, those electrolytes. So here's the gross anatomy structures of the kidney and the structures of the nephron. And we'll cover this in lecture as well. The cortex is the outer, lighter region of the kidney. The renal capsule is the fibrous connective tissue that covers the kidney. And then the renal medulla is the inner layer, darker layer that is made up of what we call these renal pyramids. And each renal pyramid has a base and an apex. And the apex will kind of collect all the urine that's being formed into kind of this central area that we'll talk about. This kind of central collecting duct is called the renal pelvis, and that exits out of a part of the kidney called the renal hilum. So, this kidney shaped structure, the medial part of the kidneys is called this renal hilum, and that's the part where the renal artery, renal vein enters and exits, and then this renal pelvis will enter and exit, which will eventually go on and be called the ureter, which takes all of the urine that has been created and funneled down. The ureter takes that urine into the bladder. Here's kind of a look at this funneling system. So here's our renal pyramid where urine is formed, and urine is funneled into what we call a minor calyx. So each renal pyramid is connected to a minor calyx. And then when we have two minor calyxes come together, they form a major calyx. And the major calyxes come together and form the renal pelvis, which is this kind of central funnel collection system. And the renal pelvis then takes the urine out through the ureter. Here's another look. This takes you through how the renal artery kind of branches and brings the blood to all the nephrons in the kidney. And again, we'll cover a lot more of this in lecture. This just takes us through the anatomy of it. But the renal artery will branch into a segmental artery, into an interlobar artery, and then eventually into an arcuate vein, and then an interlobular artery. This branching just describes basically how the renal artery brings blood into the nephron, the kidney's filtering system. And then once the blood is filtered, it will exit out in a similar branching nomenclature naming system out through the renal vein. And again, the renal artery and renal vein enter and exit the kidney in what we call the renal hilum. Here's the basic functional unit of the kidney is the nephron. So this is where the kidney's filtering system occurs. And the kidney has many, many nephrons in it. But if you kind of zoom in here, you can see the renal cortex, the outer lighter colored layer, and then the renal medulla. So this is kind of one renal pyramid shown here. You can see it zoomed in from this white circle. The center collecting duct will collect all the urine that's formed into the minor calyx, which will be right below here. And then if we go through the collecting system, you can see all of these arteries entering and exiting what we call a renal corpuscle. And within the renal corpuscle is what we call the glomerulus. The renal corpuscle describes the entire kind of structure. And then the Bowman's capsule is the outer part of the renal corpuscle. The inner part is the glomerulus, which is the kidney's filtering system. There's teeny tiny arteries that make up the glomerulus where the blood is filtered through that. Whatever is filtered out of the blood in this glomerulus will travel through the proximal convoluted tubule, which is the tubule closest to the glomerulus. And then that filtrate will travel down the thick and thin descending loop of Henle, and then back up the thin and thick ascending loop of Henle. The filtrate will either absorb more electrolytes or secrete things at this point. Then the filtrate will travel through the distal convoluted tubule furthest away from the glomerulus and then enter into the central collecting duct. So again, to review, blood is filtered through the glomerulus. The filtrate that comes out of that goes through the proximal convoluted tubule, down the thick and thin descending loop of Henle, up back the thin and thick ascending loop of Henle, through the distal convoluted tubule into the central collecting duct. And at this point, urine has been formed and will exit out into the funnel system that we talked about, the minor, the major calyx, and then the renal pelvis, and out of the ureter. Here's another look at the structures of the nephron without the peritubular capillaries, which would normally surround them around the loop of Henle. But here is the afferent and efferent arteriole, which take blood into the glomerulus and then out after it's been filtered. Here's the glomerulus, these tight kind of capillaries that the blood gets filtered through. The podocytes are specific cells that just surround these glomerular capillaries, and they allow filtrate to be kind of pushed through via pressure through the slits. The filtrate then goes through the proximal convoluted tubule, down the descending loop of Henle, the thick and thin portions, up the ascending loop of Henle, the thin and thick portions, into the distal convoluted tubule. And this kind of shows you the difference between the descending and ascending loops and what makes up their walls in the cells. Here's a look at the glomerulus. Again, the afferent arteriole brings blood into the glomerulus where it's filtered via very high pressure. And then the efferent arteriole takes the filtered blood out of the glomerulus. Here are macula densa cells. They're part of the distal convoluted tubule, juxtaglomerular cells. These are cells that help to determine just blood pressure and volume and the composition of that filtrate to see if anything else needs to be absorbed or secreted. And then here's the proximal convoluted tubule that will come out of this glomerular capsule because it will take the filtrate down that loop of Henle route. Another look at the renal corpuscle. Again, the renal corpuscle describes this entire apparatus. The Bowman's capsule is the outer layer capsular that surrounds it. The Bowman's space will be the space that all the filtrate travels through. Here's the glomerulus, these tightly wound capillaries with the podocytes, the cells that surround those capillary walls. The proximal convoluted tubule is directly attached to the glomerulus. And then here we have the afferent arteriole bringing blood into the glomerulus. It will always have thicker walls because it's bringing blood in at a much higher pressure. And the efferent arteriole will be much thinner walls because it's taking the blood away. Here's the distal convoluted tubule aligned with the macula densa cells, again in close contact with the afferent arteriole. Here's another great look of the nephron, and it's labeling in order the route that the filtrate will take. So this is a great model, kind of labeling the different structures in order to help you remember just kind of the progression of filtrate as it's being formed eventually into 8, the collecting duct. Here's a look at the bladder itself and how it's made of the urinary bladder epithelium, which has the ability to stretch. The detrusor muscle, so your bladder is made of this detrusor muscle. It's made of kind of this involuntary smooth muscle, which means your bladder will be able to empty involuntarily, but what you control voluntarily is the sphincters or the valves that will open and close to allow the urine to exit out of the urethra. This is a male model because it's showing the prostate right below the bladder. The trigone is this triangular shaped structure at the base of the bladder. The urethra takes the urine out of the body, and the ureter is coming from the kidneys. And that's the urinary system. If this was a lot for lab, We'll cover a lot more in lecture. That might be a little, it'll explain things a little bit more, but thanks for listening. Again, this is the last lab exercise.